History as it happens, March 17th, 2022. This new Cold War.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Action is doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
With the Cold War behind us, we also want to move toward partnership between our militaries. And the president will want to discuss...
This new relationship has its roots in the new Russian Revolution.
By a great revolutionary by the name of Boris Yeltsin.
The Cold War days are over.
The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is over.
Russia's war on Ukraine may inaugurate a new era of hostility with Moscow. That's how historian Mary Elise Sarotte sees it, an even more dangerous Cold War than the one that ended some 30 years ago, raising hopes for a Europe whole and free. But decades of NATO expansion to former Soviet possessions both angered Russia and left Ukraine on the other side of Europe's new dividing line. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
NATO can do for Europe's East what it did for Europe's West.
Three of Europe's new democracies, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, into the NATO alliance.
It's not whether NATO, it's how can I get in?
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. Russia is not the enemy of the United States.
What's frightening is that the nuclear weapons are still there. Obviously, they've been decreased in number, but more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Washington and Moscow, between them, still control 90% of the nuclear warheads on this planet. And it's certainly more than enough to devastate life on Earth.
The early 1990s were momentous times. We got to witness history unfolding on our televisions. I'll never forget where I was May 25th, 1993.
We're down to 50 seconds left in the fourth quarter. Starks. Yes! What a move by Starks, who was able to sky to the basket.
And I'm still annoyed the Knicks somehow lost that series. Not what you were expecting to hear, huh? Well, I was a teenager, and the outcome of the Knicks series was a lot more important to me than, say, the fate of post-Soviet Russia. But you know, a lot of Americans were paying less attention to foreign affairs those days. After managing the end of the Cold War and leading a coalition to expel Saddam from Kuwait, President Bush was sent packing by the American people in the 1992 election. Because domestic issues, namely a recession and tax increases,
Read my lips. No new taxes.
crowded out the aftermath of the Cold War on the campaign trail. And it would be up to Bill Clinton to define U.S. leadership in a Europe without a Warsaw Pact and Iron Curtain. As hard as it is to imagine today, U.S. Russia relations were in pretty good shape in those days. Clinton and Boris Yeltsin had a surprising rapport. At one point, Yeltsin even suggested Russia should join NATO, the military alliance that would soon include former members of the communist bloc.
I'm not sure we could have avoided some deterioration in the relationship. I don't think it could have been all wine and roses forever. But the way NATO expanded certainly hastened the deterioration.
Mary Elise Sarotte is our guest, and she has written a book for our time, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. I don't usually recommend books here, but this one, yes. It'll help you understand how we got to this point, where just the possibility of cooperation and communication between two nuclear-armed states seems remote. You know, even if some Americans stopped paying attention to what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic after the Cold War, our leaders did not. They were aware, as welcome as the collapse of Soviet communism was, that the new era would present difficulties, especially when it came to when and how to enlarge NATO, and to whom. Clinton embraced different visions at different times. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, which was home to a huge number of nuclear warheads, they all wanted to join NATO, sooner rather than later. But U.S. leaders from Bush to Clinton to Bush worried that going too quickly could upend relations with Russia as Russia was turning away from democratic reforms, turning into a kleptocracy and police state, and invading Chechnya, to name a few issues.
Certainly, I agree with what President Yeltsin said, that there is no animosity. The Cold War days are over, and he came here in a spirit of forward movement on these arms control agreements, and that speaks for itself.
Today in Moscow, we have taken a historic step closer to a peaceful, undivided, democratic Europe for the first time in history.
Russia has tended to view the expansion of freedom and democracy as a threat to its interests. The opposite is true. Free and prosperous societies on Russia's borders will advance Russia's interests by serving as sources of stability and economic opportunity.
From the moment the USSR vanished, Ukraine held a special place in this difficult balancing act. Ukraine had nukes, it had been part of the USSR since 1922, and as we're all well aware of now, Vladimir Putin and like-minded Russian nationalists have never recognized Ukraine's independence. Putin views the collapse of the USSR as a tragedy. He resents the fact Gorbachev did not use force to hold the state together. Mary Elise Sarotte is a historian at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and author of, as mentioned, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. Mary Elise Sarotte, it is great to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So are you the busiest historian in the United States these days?
Oh, my God. It is busy. It is busy. Although, unfortunately, for a very tragic reason, which is that Russian President Vladimir Putin keeps saying not 1 inch in somewhat deranged press conferences, and then in even more deranged fashion, using that as justification for brutalizing Ukraine.
Not a single inch to the east, they told us in the 90s. And what do you know? They cheated.
It's been a very, very strange time for me, having written, as you know, a book called Not 1 Inch. And I just hope that the diplomats can find a way to bring the violence in Ukraine to an end as soon as possible.
It takes years to research and write such a book. And as you were doing so, I wanted to ask if you developed a sense of foreboding at all. Not that you could foresee the future and predict that a war was going to break out on February 24th. But I'm guessing you thought a conflict might be possible at some point.
It actually was kind of the other way around. It was because I had a sense of foreboding that I decided to work on the book. It was clear to me from another book I had written called The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, that the events of 1989 had deeply scarred Putin, who was present for many of them in East Germany as a junior KGB or secret police officer. And I thought, instead of looking at the end of the Cold War as a joyous event, which I think it was, and I was studying in West Berlin in 1989, which is where my interest in this topic comes from. Instead of looking at it as a joyous event, which it was for most of the world, what about looking at it as a terrible event? In other words, what about looking at people for whom the wall coming down was a disaster, above all Putin? And as I started to look at it, I realized just how consistently he had voiced grievances about the wall coming down, about the loss of Soviet power in Eastern Europe, about the swift withdrawal, and specifically about the lack of violence. He regretted that the Soviet Union did not militarily defend its position. I was also aware of a very curious phenomenon. This is not from my own research, but just from paying attention to the news, which is that Putin appears to like somewhat gruesome birthday and anniversary presents. And what I mean by that is people around him know that he likes tributes on important birthdays, important anniversaries. So, for example, Putin particularly despised the journalist and activist Anna Politkovskaya, who chronicled his brutality in Chechnya, which I fear may be a precursor for his brutality in Kyiv and elsewhere. And she was a real thorn in his side. And she was assassinated by a professional killer on October 7th, 2006. October 7th is Putin's birthday. And he made public comments saying basically what an insignificant person she was, and more or less saying that he was glad she was gone. Similarly, the fast forward to the U.S. election campaign in 2016, the John Podesta email hack the Russians who hacked John Podesta's email released that on October 7th, 2016, Putin's birthday. And if you start looking back at October 7th, you start to see a pattern. In Chechnya, for example, there was a particularly violent event on October 7th, 1999. And then Putin also cares about the anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which he's, of course, called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So for the 25th anniversary of that in 2016, he, hacked the U.S. election. So I had the sense of this ongoing grievance, and then I had the awareness that the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse was coming up, and I started to get this sense of foreboding, as you rightly said. That's spot on. And I thought, I wonder if he'll try to push this on the 30th anniversary of Soviet collapse. So I decided to publish the book for that date. And, I have such deeply mixed feelings because as a kind of cold-blooded analyst, I'm glad my analysis was correct. But as a warm-blooded human being, I'm horrified that he's chosen to mark that anniversary by first amassing a deadly killing force on the Ukrainian border and then slaughtering Ukrainians wholesale. I mean, even I didn't think it would be that violent that quickly.
And I did not know those things about Putin. So these comparisons some people are making to Stalin don't sound so crazy anymore. As a non-historian, it never ceases to amaze me the way current events force us to reassess and then reassess again the recent past. And you alluded to it just now about how the end of communism, the end of the Cold War, was viewed as a historic triumph in our country. But today we might view the end of the Soviet state, as opposed to the end of communist dictatorship, as having not worked out very well. And more importantly, the transition to democracy and capitalism in Russia were disastrous.
Well, in general, I believe that to understand the present, it's best to look to the past. And I think that the past, while it does not allow you to predict the future, it does allow you to prepare for it. So I think that you're absolutely right that we need to look at recent history in light of what is happening. To be clear, the end of the division of Europe was a triumph, was a joyous moment. It provided vastly freer life choices, vast opportunities for Central and Eastern Europeans who had suffered under Soviet dominion. I'm not trying to challenge that narrative. I've written a book along those lines. What I'm trying to say is, we rightly focused on that in the first instance. But if we go back and look again, the way that the end of the Cold War not just provided opportunity to the many, but also did extensive damage to the one, namely Vladimir Putin, and how his grievances and bitterness coming out of that are part of what's fueling him today. And then moving from the individual to the state, what you said about the Soviet Union is right as well. My colleague and friend, Serhii Plokhy at Harvard, and also the CNA analyst, Michael Kaufman, they have both rightly stressed the links between today's violence and Soviet collapse. The rough concept is as follows. We in the West think of Soviet collapse as an event that happened on December 21st, 1991. That is a mistake. Soviet collapse was not an event. It's a process, and it's actually still going on.
Yes, end of an empire. It takes time to see all the ripple effects.
Exactly. Empires die messy, protracted deaths. Empires do not just disappear nicely and neatly on paper in one day. And so Michael Kaufman has used the phrase, the wars of Soviet succession, to describe what we've seen since basically Putin came to power. So the renewal of the war in Chechnya in 1999, the fighting in Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and now Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine in 2022. And I like that concept of wars of Soviet succession, a battle over where the borders of the shrunken Soviet imperium will be. And I think if we understand what's happening now in that context, it starts to tie everything together. Especially since Putin is someone who lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is lived memory for him, and his efforts to undo it make sense in that contest.
And not just him, the Russian establishment.
And not just him.
Although maybe a different leader wouldn't have started a war, but that's a counterfactual. The final impetus for me to reach out to you via email to see if you'd come on the podcast wasn't your book. It was the op-ed you wrote recently in the New York Times, the other Times, about the coming Cold War as you see it. Why did you say the next Cold War will be worse than the first?
I think that we have lost many characteristics of what we're going to have to call the old Cold War that helped that conflict end without violence. This list is not exhaustive. There are other characteristics that are gone, but three big ones that jumped out to me three ones that I highlighted in the New York Times op-ed were as follows. The first is that we've lost many of the arms control agreements that provided what I called guardrails to competition between Washington and Moscow.
On the Soviet side, over 1,500 deployed warheads will be removed, and all ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, including the SS-20s, will be destroyed.
What's frightening is that the nuclear weapons are still there. Obviously, they've been decreased in number, but more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Washington and Moscow, between them, still control 90% of the nuclear warheads on this planet. And it's certainly more than enough to devastate life on Earth. But we don't have anymore the Intermediate Range Forces Nuclear Agreement. We don't have the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and so forth. In fact, the only treaty that currently constrains Washington and Moscow is the New START Treaty. It expires in 2026 unless it's renewed. And I'm guessing chances of renewal are limited at this point between Washington and Moscow. So we have the two most important nuclear powers in the world that are unconstrained and operating also almost in isolation from one another because we've expelled mutually so many embassy staff, consulate staff, shut down military to military contacts and so forth. So those are all Cold War guardrails that are gone. That was the first. And then the second is there used to be much more of a cultural awareness of the Cold War. There were made-for-TV movies like The Day After in 1983.
MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction.
MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And so there was just kind of a cultural awareness of what it would mean to have a nuclear exchange.
Is the Premier threatening to explode this if our planes carry out their attack?
No, sir. It is not a thing a sane man would do. The doomsday machine is designed to trigger itself automatically.
But surely you can disarm it somehow?
No. It is designed to explode if any attempt is ever made to untrigger it.
Automatically?
It's an obvious commie trick, Mr. President. We're wasting valuable time. Look at the big war. They're getting ready to clobber us.
And that, I think, is gone. Just before the war started, Russia and Belarus had a quote-unquote exercise, which was just a pretext to get Russian forces into Belarus, we know now, to invade Ukraine. But I heard someone who sounded like a young journalist covering the exercise in Russia and Belarus, and Putin had announced it would include nuclear exercises. And this younger journalist said something like, but they won't actually be firing off nuclear weapons in this exercise. And I thought, well, of course they won't be firing off. Like the way this person said this was almost like, well, they won't be using live fire in this ammunition. I thought, this person doesn't understand what that means. Like we've lost this cultural awareness of what it would mean to actually have a nuclear weapon go off. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned before the chance of the two sides coming together to reach an accommodation or to start negotiating again, even if they don't like each other. In preparation for my podcasts, I watch a lot of old news conferences, and I believe it was 2007, maybe 2009, at Kennebunkport. It was 2007. George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin talking to a small group of reporters after they went fishing. They were very chummy.
First, I'd like to congratulate President Putin for being the only person that caught a fish today.
We've got one fish, but that was a team effort, and the merit goes to the captain of the
Very thoughtful of you.
A scene impossible to imagine happening today. But they were there to discuss some important issues, a missile shield in Poland and the Czech Republic that, of course, Moscow did not want and that the United States was insisting upon. So it's impossible to think that we could even get back to something like that.
Yeah, just to finish the three things that we'd lost from the Cold War.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. Number one was the guardrails of arms control agreements. Number two is a cultural awareness. And number three were tacit codes of conduct that prevented smaller incidents from escalating. And so those are the things that I think we could use again, and that was what I focused on my New York Times op-ed. Yeah, on 2007, I think you've identified an important year. 2007 is when Putin, in addition to meeting with Bush, gives a speech at the Munich Security Conference where he takes what is clearly an unambiguous hard line against the West. And in hindsight, it was essentially a warning to NATO, hands off Georgia and Ukraine. The West, of course, chose not to regard that. And so in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, then NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine, quote, will become members. But 2007 is definitely, I think, an important turning point. There's also the impact of what we'll call the color revolutions in the former Soviet republics. That's all happening around that time, and that all contributes, I think, to the hardening of Putin's position.
And again, I'm sorry for interjecting there, but you brought up the point about the accidental escalation. I am very worried about that right now. We know that wars can start by accident.
Right, of course, yes. Now, fortunately, we're not the only two people worried about this. There is a great deal of training that goes into service people are trained in this. But what's scary is that just before the war broke out, Russian pilots, for example, were showing a frightening willingness to showboat and to buzz American planes and American ships. At one point, a Russian plane reportedly flew within 5 feet of an American plane. That is insanely dangerous. If they hit, they're going to, it's going to be a midair collision and it's probably going to be fatalities. And so already before the war, we were seeing those kind of events. And the question is whether, we're going to keep seeing them. As we are recording, I heard that yesterday there was explosions going off just within 15 miles of the Polish border. That's really close to Article 5 territory.
I often caution against viewing one's foes as irrational and unhinged while viewing your own actions as sane, rational, defensive. But I did have Anthony Beaver, the great military historian, on the podcast recently, and he said Putin is a dangerous beast. He could be feeling cornered. He's living in a historical fantasy land in terms of the way he views Ukraine and his role in the world. And Sir Anthony is worried that Putin might go after other countries.
Right. I mean, obviously, my crystal ball is not better than anyone else's, but it is alarming how violently Putin has proceeded in Ukraine and how brazenly. It was really astonishing to see the bombardment of Kyiv start so quickly. I thought that perhaps he would take a land bridge between, Crimea and the areas he's already seized, but to see Kyiv come under attack so quickly was really shocking. And then just the sheer brutality. I mean, I really have to say a word of respect and admiration for the people of Ukraine who have put up just unbelievably admirable resistance to a truly horrific attack. So it is hard to, shall we say, calmly conclude that this won't spill outside of Ukraine's borders. Also, now that Belarus is de facto part of Russia and a material party to this war, one does have to wonder about the Baltics, right? Will troops go from Belarus not only south, but north and west? And
I don't mean to imply that he might invade Poland, but the Baltics, which are small and weak countries.
It's all Article 5 territory. So Article 5 for your listeners, of course, the heart of the NATO treaty. It's the article that stipulates that all member states must treat an attack on one member state as an attack on all. Obviously, there's some wiggle room there, what constitutes an attack, what constitutes a response, but still, that is a very strong guarantee, and all Article 5 territory enjoys it, whether it's Baltic territory or Polish territory.
So Mary Elise Sarotte, my great interviewing skills on display, some 20 minutes into our conversation, and we're getting to your book.
There's a lot going on.
Yes, there is. Well, I valued your insights there about what's happening right now. Not 1 inch. Vladimir Putin repeats those words. It's the main title of your book. That comes from, 1990? James Baker, or was it 1989?
90.
90. I just read your book, so I should remember that. I'm not being tested. So this was not a promise per se. It didn't become U.S. policy. Take us through this meeting, Baker and Gorbachev. What was said, and more importantly, how was it interpreted afterward?
Sure, I will do that. Let me just provide a little context on that phrase, not 1 inch. The phrase not 1 inch arises from the controversy that I'm about to describe. The reason I decided to use it as a title for the whole book, however, is slightly different. It starts off with the not 1 inch controversy in 1990, which is James Baker, the Secretary of State, saying to the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. But I realized as I was writing the book, which looks at the 90s in detail and then comes forward to the present, that the phrase not 1 inch applied throughout. In other words, it was still applicable in the Clinton years, although it took on the exact opposite meaning. In the Clinton years, not 1 inch came to mean not 1 inch of Europe needs to be off limits to NATO. So I realized that phrase was useful because it spanned the period from the George H.W. Bush presidency to the Clinton presidency, and we'll discuss the details of that. Okay, so getting to the details of the 1990 controversy. Yes, this is obviously well known, and I believe you talked about some of this with my colleague, Professor Jeff Engel, already in a previous podcast. The basic context is as follows. The Berlin Wall has come down on November 9th, 1989. It is clear that Germans want to unify. It is also clear, however, that there is a problem. When Germany surrendered unconditionally in 1945, it surrendered unconditionally, no conditions, no limits, no deadline, no nothing. So as of 1989-90, there are still legal rights emanating from that surrender that apply. The four victor powers, the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviet Union still have troops in Germany. So in order for Germany to unify, you have to resolve that situation. Now, it's clear the Western powers are willing to let Germany unify, and they'll find other ways for their troops to be there, in particular through NATO. They have already found the ways. But the big question is the Soviet Union. Will the Soviet Union basically give up its half of Germany? And if so, what will it want in exchange for doing that? And so as part of many, many conversations to square that circle, on February 9th, 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker said, as a hypothetical question to Mikhail Gorbachev, how about this? How about you let your part of Germany go, and we agree that NATO's jurisdiction will not shift 1 inch eastward? I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotations are in my book, not 1 inch, for your readers if they want to see the exact wording. And Gorbachev basically agrees with that. He says, certainly NATO should not go eastward. That sounds right. And they basically more or less agreed to, come back to it. But then when James Baker flies home to his boss and old friend, President George H.W. Bush, President Bush says to him, Jim, that's not right. You've leaned too far forward over your skis. Think about it. If we leave NATO where it is now, if it does not move 1 inch, that means it'll stay frozen on the Cold War dividing line forever. And that Cold War line runs through Germany. That would mean that a united Germany, which is the point of this whole exercise, would be half in and half out of NATO, and that makes no sense. Also, we don't need to give that to him, right? There's other ways we can do this.
Money.
He has money, right? He hasn't asked for us, exactly. And so a man who later became Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, who at that point was Deputy National Security Advisor, the way he put it was as follows. He said, our strategy is, quote, bribing the Soviets out. In other words, with money. And even better, the West Germans are going to pay the bribe because they want unification so badly. So that is actually what ends up happening. The problem is it takes Gorbachev a while to notice that this not 1 inch offer is off the table. And he starts to really sense it in the spring. And he begins to realize he's not getting that in writing. And finally, at the end of 1990, in the document that does unify Germany, the final settlement of September 12th, 1990, he finally gives up and he authorizes signature of that document in exchange for financial inducements, not for guarantees about NATO. And the kicker is that that document, the final settlement of September 12th, 1990, explicitly allows NATO to extend Article 5 eastward across the Cold War line into Eastern Germany. And Moscow signs it. That, of course, never comes up in Putin's press conferences, but that is in the signed, legally binding treaty.
And that's called the 2+4 Treaty.
That's the colloquial name. So the colloquial name is 2+4 Treaty because it's the two Germanys, East and West Germany, plus the four victor powers, the U.S., the U.K., France, and the Soviet Union. The formal name is the final settlement on Germany.
But there were some concessions in there.
Yes.
In the fine print. But ultimately, the letter and the spirit of the document, well, depending on who you ask, because a few years later, Yeltsin is claiming the treaty doesn't allow NATO to move east, but that aside, the letter and the spirit, the way I see it, I think the way you see it, allowed for NATO to move east, and not only into East Germany, because there could potentially be NATO in Poland, and so not just German troops in East Germany. There would be foreign NATO troops, so to speak, in East Germany, right?
Well, let's separate for a minute the letter and the spirit.
Okay.
And also, I want to bring back in the point you made about concessions. So let me, again, provide some context and then talk about the specifics.
Please do.
So it was clear to savvy observers that NATO enlargement was not one uniform process. Put differently, the cost per inch of expanding NATO was higher for countries that bordered the Soviet Union or Russia. In particular, when NATO was being founded in 1949, there was one country that actually had a border with the Soviet Union, and that was Norway. And Norway, in recognition of that, in recognition of the need to manage frictions with Moscow long-term, despite joining the alliance, Norway imposed restrictions on itself. And I refer to this as the Scandinavian Strategy, setting aside for the minute whether Norway is Nordic or Scandinavian before all your readers, listeners hate me. Scandinavian Strategy had the alliteration. The upshot there is that the Norwegians intentionally restricted themselves. They said no foreign troops on our territory in peacetime, and no nuclear weapons on our territory or in our ports. The idea there was to recognize that the cost per inch of bringing NATO to the Soviet Union's border was higher than, say, putting in Spain or France, and to try to manage the frictions with Moscow. And it worked. Norway was a member and is a member of the alliance and has not had an invasion from the Soviet Union or from Russia. So fast forward to 1990, and your very smart point about concessions. George H.W. Bush, when he said to Baker, forget this idea about NATO moving not 1 inch eastward. He didn't use these words, but the concept was the same. He implied we're going to use the Scandinavian strategy. We're going to make concessions as we move eastward across the Cold War border, but we are going to move. We are going to keep expanding.
So Gorbachev would have something at home to show.
So Gorbachev would have something at home.
Yeah.
And so the concessions were that the territory of East Germany, the former territory of East Germany, which is now the eastern part of United Germany, would be permanently denuclearized, thus meaning that to this day, the former East German territory is now the only part of Europe guaranteed to have no nuclear weapons on it by treaty, which, by the way, now creates a vulnerability with Berlin being the capital and war with Russia on the horizon, because that whole area can't have any kind of nuclear defenses. And they also made concessions that foreign troops would not be permanently deployed, although they could be present. So this, I think, was savvy, and this was, the updating of the Scandinavian strategy. Okay, so now you get to the letter of the agreement. The letter of the agreement is that Article 5 can extend into Eastern Germany with those concessions. All right, so that's 1990. That's the letter.
And that's what Bush really wanted.
And that's what Bush really wanted.
Germany in NATO.
Right. So now what's becoming apparent, because of what Putin's been talking about recently, is that there is both a 1990 controversy and a 1997 controversy. Because Putin has been saying in press conferences that he wants NATO to go back to where its forces were on May 27th, 1997, thus causing most people in the world to say, what? What happened on May 27th, 1997? Right?
You would know, but probably no one else.
Right, exactly. And causing me to slap my forehead and say, oh my God, he wants to refight that battle from the NATO-Russia Founding Act negotiations. So basically, in 1997, fast forward now, Bill Clinton is president.
A democratic, free, non-aggressive, that is, in a destructive sense, non-aggressive Russia, is not threatened by an expanded NATO, particularly now that there's going to be a partnership to work in areas which are in our common interest to work.
And Central and Eastern Europeans have been pressing to join NATO. At this point, President Boris Yeltsin weighs in and says, well, he's been doing this all along, but he starts to do it in a really serious way. He weighs in and says, you cannot put Central and Eastern Europe in NATO, among other reasons, because of the 2+4 treaty. And what becomes apparent is that the West and Russia agree on one thing. There's one thing they agree on, despite all the controversy, which is that the 2+4 treaty, also known as the final settlement on Germany, that it dealt only with Germany. They agree on that. That's the only thing they agree on, because they cannot agree what that means. So Yeltsin's view is, since that treaty dealt only with Germany, it in no way allows NATO to go into any other countries. And the spirit of the treaty is that NATO would only go into Eastern Germany and stop there. That's Yeltsin's interpretation of the spirit. The Clinton administration, in particular the State Department, and there's a study by the State Department, says, no, that's exactly wrong. The treaty deals only with Germany. It says nothing about Central and Eastern Europe. We can do whatever we want in Central and Eastern Europe. The treaty does not bind us in any way, shape, or form because it's only about Germany. And so this is where it starts to get nasty, because now it's about, oh, well, but I heard in our conversations that you only wanted to do Germany. Well, but that's not what's written down. If you'd wanted it blocked in Eastern Germany, you should have written it into the document, right? So now we get into, what people remember as opposed to what is within the four corners of the document.
I want to go back to Gorbachev, someone who I've always respected. What an amazing figure. But seen from the Russian point of view, And I learned this reading your book. The degree to which he vacillates, he's not quite sure what he wants. Of course, events are spinning out of control. I don't think anybody might have been able to handle the consequences of what he set in motion, he himself set in motion. He wanted a European security system, a pan-European security system. But as I said, he vacillates on these issues. And he's also worried about the hardliners back home in Moscow who don't want to give up their empire. They don't want to give up East Germany. They viewed that as their backyard.
Well, more than that, and this I think is completely understandable. The deaths in the Soviet Union during World War II were measured in the tens of millions, right? There was a sense that the Soviet Union had earned the right to control Germany or its part of it in perpetuity on the basis of the sheer amount of bloodshed. And even Gorbachev, who was clearly a reformer, was not prepared to let East Germany go. When American President Ronald Reagan said, "Tear down this wall," in his June 1987 speech.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
The end result of that particular speech was nothing. Gorbachev basically ignored it. He did not tear down that wall. As much as a reformer as he was also a patriot to his country, the Soviet Union. And he, like most Soviet citizens, grew up hearing the stories of the Soviet suffering during the war against the Nazis and felt strongly that the Soviet Union had a right to be in Germany. And he did not intend to open the wall or intend to lose control of East Germany. There's a series of historic accidents that lead the wall to open, which I described in my book, The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. And then Gorbachev makes the decision after that happens unexpectedly not to use force in response, for which he, in my opinion, correctly received the Nobel Peace Prize. So I actually share your feelings because I have personally a huge amount of admiration for Gorbachev, in particular for that decision not to use violence once the wall came down. And I think he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. It was therefore, in some ways, saddening to me to see what a weak negotiator he was.
Yeah, he becomes a bungler in many ways.
And this also, by the way, was apparent not just to me as a historian, but to people around him at the time. And of course, the ultimate expression of this is the coup against him in August 1991, when people can't take it anymore because they feel like he's leading the country into disaster.
You also describe a meeting during which some of his own aides sitting there with American officials basically gasp. They can't believe that he's given up certain things in negotiations with the United States.
Yes, this is a summit in Washington, May 31st and June 1st of 1990. And the Americans are talking about the Helsinki Principle, which comes out of the final act in Helsinki. And the key there is that the Helsinki Principle allows states to choose their own security alliance. And Moscow had signed on to that document. It had signed on to it in 1975 when it seemed like nobody in the Warsaw Pact would ever really have a choice, but it had signed on to it. And so President Bush, George W. Bush, was talking about this document in the Helsinki Principle. And he got a verbal agreement from Mikhail Gorbachev that, Moscow would still respect that. And that's the point at which his advisors, who were more cognizant than Gorbachev himself was of what that meant, his advisors were just visibly unhappy. The American National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, thought he might be witnessing a coup in real time unfolding in front of him at this meeting, which was taking place in Washington. He said he'd never seen anything like it. They had to break off talks because the Soviet side was in such disarray. And when they came back, it was clear that Gorbachev said something like, "I'm the boss and this is what we're doing," because all these people were sitting there with steam coming out of their ears. And eventually, one of the people involved that day actually takes part in the coup. And when the coup fails, he actually takes his own life. That's the level of frustration that Gorbachev inspired in the people around him.
So the treaty in 1990, of course, the story is only just getting started there. Events begin to take place that may or may not make previous agreements irrelevant, depending on which side you're on. We often today overlook just how fervently Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia wanted to join NATO after the Cold War, which of course complicates the picture. As you explain, the spirit of that treaty was disputed. Well, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the other nations that eventually joined NATO, they wanted to have a say in which way to go here.
Yes, absolutely. And they deserved to have one. They were New sovereign democracies, their leaders and people had bravely thrown off the yoke of Soviet control. They, according to the Helsinki Principle, which we discussed earlier, had the right to choose their own security alliance. It was well within their rights to want to be members of NATO. My book, Not One Inch, it's not an anti-NATO enlargement book. I think NATO enlargement was, in the context, reasonable. The Central and Eastern Europeans had every right to want to be in. It was not unprecedented. NATO expanded during the Cold War many times. NATO enlargement was a reasonable policy. The problem, as I describe in my book, Not One Inch, was how it happened. And unfortunately, it happened in a way that maximized Moscow's aggravation and contributed, along with various actions on the part of Moscow itself, to the deterioration of the newfound cooperation between Washington and Moscow after the end of the Cold War.
In your conclusion, you say that could have been avoided. You identify a really critical issue about which way to proceed that goes a long way toward explaining how we got to this current moment. And that is, how should NATO membership be offered? Incrementally to all states in Central and Eastern Europe, maybe even Russia and Ukraine at one point, or only to some of those states, but get them in NATO right away, thereby creating clear security zones again, which raises a whole nother host of issues. Can you explain those two attitudes or two approaches and which one won out?
Sure. And to provide the significance of this before we get into the details, in the book, I'm trying to understand how the newfound cooperation between Moscow and Washington at the end of the Cold War, which was, I think, initially genuine and led to the most extensive disarmament since the start of the nuclear age.
We've agreed to eliminate the world's most dangerous weapons, heavy ICBMs, and all other multiple warhead ICBMs.
How that deteriorated. And there are many causes. I do not argue that NATO expansion was the only cause. I'm not sure we could have avoided some deterioration in the relationship. I don't think it could have been all wine and roses forever. But the way NATO expanded certainly hastened the deterioration. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the takeaways I hope readers get out of the book is that NATO expansion was not one thing. There were multiple ways known at the time to potentially enlarge NATO. To cite one example, the Brits at one point tried to convince Washington that NATO should only be enlarged once in the post-Cold War world. The Brits said, if we try to do this too many times, we're going to drive the Russians nuts. Russia's not going to be flat on its back forever. We should do one big round and then not expand anymore. Now, obviously, the rhetoric in public will be different because you want to say you have an open door. But in reality, we should do one big round. We should take in every country we want once and be done. And the Americans pushed back strongly against that and said that is exactly the wrong approach. We need to make clear that not one inch of Europe is off limits to NATO. We need to make NATO expansion the exact opposite. It needs to be an open, iterative process without end. And in fact, instead of taking a bunch of countries, we should take the fewest possible countries to make perfectly clear that we're going to keep going. So we should only take Poland, Hungary, and half of what used to be Czechoslovakia. And there was even an American acronym for this, which was SIBROD, SIBROD. Small is beautiful, robust open door.
Oh, my.
So what I talk about in my book, to get to your question in detail, is a policy that I think, it wasn't perfect, it didn't make everybody happy, but I think was a workable compromise, and that was the Partnership for Peace. And the idea there is that Clinton himself at the time understood that. He said, to the Central and Eastern Europeans initially, I get that you want to be in NATO, but we just erased the Cold War line across Europe. Why should we now draw a new line between Article 5 and non-Article 5 countries? And in particular, that will leave Ukraine in the lurch, and it will leave other post-Soviet states in the lurch. And you, Poles, Czechs, above all others, should understand what it means to get left in the lurch behind the line, right? Because that's what happened to you during the Cold War. So we need to blur that line. We need to have a halfway house that will offer a loose affiliation with NATO to the largest possible number of states, including post-Soviet ones. And we're going to call this the Partnership for Peace. Now, it wasn't popular, right? It wasn't as desirable as being a full member, but through clenched teeth, the Poles and other Central and Eastern Europeans were willing to accept it. They saw what Clinton was saying about Ukraine, which he called the linchpin of stability in Europe. And they saw that they could become NATO members through the partnership. And this, I think, was a workable solution. It had an advantage which no other plan did, in that it was minimally acceptable to everybody. It was acceptable to the Central and Eastern Europeans, it was acceptable to the Ukrainians, and it was acceptable to the Russians.
And in the event, it did take a while for all these states to get into NATO.
And in event, it took a while, exactly. The problem is that, having figured out what I thought was a workable solution, Clinton then pushes it aside. Part of the reason for that rests with self-harming Russian choices. President Boris Yeltsin decides, starting in late 93 and then continuing into 94, to shed the blood of his political opponents, first in Moscow, then in Chechnya. And the Central and Eastern Europeans, seeing that, say, wait a minute, if the new Moscow is just like the old Moscow, killing people, then this partnership is not enough. We need Article 5. And you also have, in the United States, the Republican Party winning a huge victory in the 1994 midterm congressional elections on the basis of the contract with America, which, among other things, emphasizes giving Article 5 to countries as quickly as possible. And Clinton needs those voters if he's going to be reelected. So Clinton starts to change his mind, and he decides to marginalize the Partnership for Peace. And then he does what he said he didn't want to do, which is draw a new line across Europe.
You know, as I read your book, the question, the big question, what were these countries so worried about to begin with? The Cold War is over. As you know, some scholars, some diplomats, former diplomats, have argued that it was a mistake to enlarge NATO at all. But in the mid-1990s, early to mid-90s, Yeltsin starts to do things, the Russian establishment starts to act in a way that legitimately frightens countries in Central and Eastern Europe.
There's differing views, but there's political leaders in Central and Eastern Europe and in the United States who consistently maintain that Moscow has always been and will always be a threat. Certainly Lech Walesa thought that way. So there were Central and Eastern Europeans who felt strongly that they wanted NATO protection from Russia regardless of what had happened at the end of the Cold War. Then there were others who basically feared instability and wanted NATO alliance as a hedge against instability. Then there were others who saw NATO as a way to join the West, particularly at a time when the European Union was slow and hesitant about expanding. So there were a bunch of reasons why countries wanted to get into NATO. And these, I think, are perfectly understandable and justifiable. The problem, of course, is the friction that it creates with Moscow as it unfolds.
At a meeting in Warsaw, you note how Walesa, the Polish leader, asks Yeltsin about whether Poland can join NATO and would Russia object to that. And Yeltsin, who is often drunk, agrees, but then the next day he wants to retract the statement, realizing that he's made a huge mistake. Yeltsin was often drunk, especially when he was in the presence of Clinton. As I was reading this, I was kind of chuckling at it, but my gosh, it was not funny. This is a world leader who was wasted, pardon the expression, often.
Yeah, at some point I actually started wondering if, in a sense, it was a tactic, because if hard issues came up that he didn't want to address, if he had enough to drink, he had an excuse for not talking seriously about them. And obviously, he also just had a problem with drinking as well. But yes, this was certainly a feature that came up, and the Americans started the tradition of keeping a running tally of how many drinks he had at any particular summit, so they could know if it was still possible to get any useful business done. And Clinton sometimes more or less had to cover for Yeltsin in press conferences by the end of the summits, because Yeltsin would be, so inebriated by the end of summits.
In 2008, Ukraine is vaguely offered or promised membership in NATO at some future date. Was that a mistake to leave Ukraine in limbo?
I think the mistake was saying that NATO would take Ukraine on when NATO didn't really mean it. That was a compromise, mainly because the Americans were pushing very hard to make Ukraine and Georgia members. And many European countries were concerned about the Russian reaction. And so the compromise was to say that Ukraine and Georgia would become members, but not actually take any steps to make it happen, which was pretty much the worst of all worlds, because you didn't get Georgia and Ukraine in NATO, but you did create the friction with Moscow, and Putin still to this day still refers to that decision.
Yeah, Ukraine has always had a special place in this equation, beginning at the early 90s because they had nuclear weapons.
Right, of course, yeah.
So my final question, Mary Elise Sarotte, is what is your view on a no-fly zone, which could lead to war between NATO and Russia?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So on the one hand, I see why that is problematic. If you're going to set up a no-fly zone, you then need Western pilots to defend that zone. And unless you want to send those pilots on suicide missions, you need to suppress air defenses before they go up. Otherwise, those pilots will be at risk. So that means if you're doing this no-fly zone properly, the first step before anything else happens is you fly into Russia and destroy air defenses and destroy Russian runways and kill lots of Russians. That's an act of war. If we want to do that in the West, we should be clear about that's what we're going to do. So on the one hand, that is quite a serious step. On the other hand, it is just unthinkable what is happening to the Ukrainians. There may be some necessary risks worth running. One idea I'd heard recently was instead of a no-fly zone was a we-fly zone, which is we just say we're creating the following humanitarian corridors and we're going to support them. And if you want to shoot us down, come and get us. But otherwise, we're going to do this, right? Now, that obviously would be almost suicidal as well, but perhaps it could be done, somehow under blue helmets. I'm spitballing here, but, some kind of justification, because we need to help the people of Ukraine, and there may be some necessary risks that may be worth running.
They are stuck in that gray zone or no man's land that they feared during all these years of negotiations about
Exactly.
NATO.
Yes, exactly. Tragically.
Mary Elise Sarotte, you are a reminder of why we need historians right now. We thank you for your insights. On upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, we will continue to analyze the Russia-Ukraine war. Max Hastings will join us again. And we will return to our occasional series about slavery and the Constitution. We have an interview coming up with Alan Taylor. That and more as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.